Welcome to the Vox Lore. Our channel produces immersive fantasy audiobooks for entertainment and storytelling enjoyment. All content, including narration, sound design, and storytelling elements, is created with passion for fantasy fans. Part 2 of A Son of the Middle Border by Hamlin Garland. Let's continue the story and see what happens next. Chapter 6. David and his violin. Most of the events of our last autumn in Green's Coulee have slipped into the fathomless gulf. But the experiences of Thanksgiving Day, which followed closely on our threshing day, are in my treasure house. Like a canvas by Rembrandt, only one side of the figures therein is defined. The other side melts away into shadow. A luminous shadow, through which faint light pulses, luring my wistful gaze on, back into the vanished world where the springs of my life lie hidden. It is a raw November evening. Frank and Harriet and I are riding into a strange land in a clattering farm wagon. Father and Mother are seated before us on the spring seat. The ground is frozen and the floor of the carriage pounds and jars. We cling to the iron-lined sides of the box to soften the blows. It is growing dark. Before us, in a similar vehicle, my Uncle David is leading the way. I catch momentary glimpses of him outlined against the pale yellow sky. He stands erect, holding the reins of his swiftly moving horses in his powerful left hand. Occasionally he shouts back to my father, whose chin is buried in a thick buffalo skin coat. Mother is only a vague mass, a figure wrapped in shawls. The wind is keen, the world gray and cheerless. My sister is close beside me in the straw. Frank is asleep. I am on my knees looking ahead. Suddenly, with rush of wind and clatter of hoofs, we enter the gloom of a forest and the road begins to climb. I see the hills on the right. I catch the sound of wheels on a bridge. I am cold. I snuggle down under the robes and the gurgle of icebound water is fused with my dreams. I am roused at last by Uncle David's pleasant voice. "Wake up, boys, and pay wire lodging." I look out and perceive him standing beside the wheel. I see a house and I hear the sound of Deborah's voice from the warmly lighted open door. I climb down, heavy with cold and sleep. As I stand there, my uncle reaches up his arms to take my mother down. Not knowing that she has a rheumatic elbow, he squeezes her playfully. She gives a sharp scream, and his team starts away on a swift run around the curve of the road toward the gate. Dropping my mother, he dashes across the yard to intercept the runaways. We all stand in silence, watching the flying horses and the wonderful race he is making toward the gate. He runs with magnificent action, his head thrown high. As the team dashes through the gate, his outflung left hand catches the end board of the wagon. He leaps into the box, and so passes from our sight. We go into the cottage. It is a small building with 4 rooms and a kitchen on the ground floor, but in the sitting room we come upon an open fireplace, the first I had ever seen, and in the light of it sits Grandfather McClintock, the glory of the flaming logs gilding the edges of his cloud of bushy white hair. He does not rise to greet us, but smiles and calls out, "Come in, come in, draw a cheer, sit ye down." A clamor of welcome fills the place. Harriet and I are put to warm before the blaze. Granddad takes Frank upon his knee and the cutting wind of the gray outside world is forgotten. This house in which the McClintocks were living at this time belonged to a rented farm. Granddad had sold the original homestead on the La Crosse River, and David, who had lately married a charming young Canadian girl, was the head of the family. Deborah, it seems, was also living with him, and Frank was there, as a visitor probably. The room in which we sat was small and bare, but to me it was very beautiful, because of the fire, and by reason of the merry voices which filled my ears with music. Aunt Rebecca brought to us a handful of crackers and told us that we were to have oyster soup for supper. This gave us great pleasure even in anticipation, for oysters were a delicious treat in those days. "Well, Dick," Granddad began, "so ye're plannin' to go west, air ye?" "Yes. As soon as I get all my grain and hogs marketed, I'm going to pull out for my new farm over in Iowa." "Ye'd better stick to the old coulee," warned my grandfather, a touch of sadness in his voice. "Ye'll find none better." My father was disposed to resent this. "That's all very well for the few who have the level land in the middle of the valley," he retorted. "But how about those of us who are crowded against the hills? You should see the farm I have in Winshike. Not a hill on it big enough for a boy to coast on. It's right on the edge of Looking-Glass Prairie, and I have a spring of water and a fine grove of trees just where I want them, not where they have to be grubbed out. But ye belong here, repeated grandfather. You were married here, your children were born here. Ye'll find no such friends in the West as you have here in Neshonoc. And Belle will miss the family. My father laughed. Oh, you'll all come along. Dave has the fever already. Even William is likely to catch it. Old Hugh sighed deeply. I hope ye're wrong, he said. I'd like to spend me last days here with me sons and daughters around me, such as are left to me. Here his voice became sterner. It's the curse of our country. This constant moving. I'd have been better off had I stayed in Ohio, though this valley seemed very beautiful to me the first time I saw it. At this point David came in, and everybody shouted, Did you stop them? Referring of course to the runaway team. I did, he replied with a smile. But how about the oysters? I'm holler as a beach log. The fragrance of the soup thoroughly awakened even little Frank, and when we drew around the table, each face shone with the light of peace and plenty, and all our elders tried to forget that this was the last Thanksgiving festival which the McClintocks and Garlands would be able to enjoy in the Old Valley. How good those oysters were! They made up the entire meal, excepting mince pie which came as a closing sweet. Slowly, one by one, the men drew back and returned to the sitting room, leaving the women to wash up the dishes and put the kitchen to rights. David seized the opportunity to ask my father to tell once again of the trip he had made, of the lands he had seen, and the farm he had purchased, for his young heart was also fired with desire of exploration. The level lands toward the sunset allured him. In his visions the wild meadows were filled with game, and the free lands needed only to be tickled with a hoe to laugh into harvest. He said, As soon as Dad and Frank are settled on a farm here, I'm going west also. I'm as tired of climbing these hills as you are. I want a place of my own, and besides, from all you say of that wheat country out there, a threshing machine would pay wonderfully well. As the women came in, my father called out, Come, Belle, sing o'er the hills and legions, boys. Dave, get out your fiddle, and tune us all up. David tuned up his fiddle, and while he twanged on the strings, Mother lifted her voice in our fine old marching song. Cheer up, brothers, as we go o'er the mountains, westward ho! And we all joined in the jubilant chorus. Then o'er the hills and legions, boys, fair freedom star points to the sunset regions, boys, ha 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 ha. My father's face shone with the light of the explorer, the pioneer. The words of this song appealed to him as the finest poetry. It meant all that was fine and hopeful and buoyant in American life, to him. But on my mother's sweet face a wistful expression deepened, and in her fine eyes a reflective shadow lay. To her this song meant not so much the acquisition of a new home as the loss of all her friends and relatives. She sang it submissively, not exultantly, and I think the other women were of the same mood, though their faces were less expressive to me. To all of the pioneer wives of the past that song had meant deprivation, suffering, loneliness, heartache. From this they passed to other of my father's favorite songs, and it is highly significant to note that even in this choice of songs he generally had his way. He was the dominating force. Sing Nellie Wildwood, he said, and they sang it. This power of getting his will respected was due partly to his military training but more to a distinctive trait in him. He was a man of power, of decision, a natural commander of men. They sang Minnie Minturn to his request, and the refrain, I have heard the angel's warning, I have seen the golden shore, meant much to me, so did the line, but I only hear the drummers as the armies march away. Aunt Deb was also a soul of decision. She called out, No more of these sad tones, and struck up the Year of Jubilo, and we all shouted till the walls shook with the exultant words, Ol Massa run, ha ha, de darky stay, ho ho. It must be now is the kingdom a-comin' in the Year of Jubilo. At this point the fire suggested an old English ballad which I loved, and so I piped up, Mother, sing, Pile the wood on higher, and she complied with pleasure. For this was a song of home, of the unbroken fireside circle. Oh, the winds howl mad outdoors, the snow clouds hurry past, the giant trees sway to and fro beneath the sweeping blast. And we children joined in the chorus. Then we'll gather round the fire and we'll pile the wood on higher. Let the song and jest go round. What care we for the storm, when the fireside is so warm and pleasure here is found? Never before did this song mean so much to me as at this moment when the winds were actually howling outdoors, and Uncle Frank was in very truth piling the logs higher. It seemed as though my stuffed bosom could not receive anything deeper and finer. But it did, for Father was saying, "Well, Dave, now for some tunes." This was the best part of David to me. He could make any room mystical with the magic of his bow. True, his pieces were mainly venerable dance tunes, cotillions, hornpipes, melodies which had passed from fiddler to fiddler until they had become veritable folk songs, pieces like Money Musk, Honest John, Haste to the Wedding, and many others whose names I have forgotten, but with a gift of putting into even the simplest song an emotion which subdued us and silenced us, he played on, absorbed and intent. From these familiar pieces he passed to others for which he had no names, melodies strangely sweet and sad, full of longing cries, voicing something which I dimly felt but could not understand. At the moment he was the somber Scotch Highlander, the true Celt, and as he bent above his instrument his black eyes glowing, his fine head drooping low, my heart bowed down in worship of his skill. He was my hero, the handsomest, most romantic figure in all my world. He played, "Maggie, ere ye sleepin'," and the wind outside went to my soul. Voices wailed to me out of the illimitable hill-land forests, voices that pleaded, "Oh, let me in, for loud the Lynn goes roarin' o'er the moorland craggy." He appeared to forget us, even his young wife. His eyes looked away into gray storms. Vague longing ached in his throat. Life was a struggle, love a torment. He stopped abruptly, and put the violin into its box, fumbling with the catch to hide his emotion, and my father broke the tense silence with a prosaic word. "Well, well, look here, it's time you youngsters were asleep. Becky, where are you going to put these children?" Aunt Rebecca, a trim little woman with brown eyes, looked at us reflectively. "Well now, I don't know. I guess we'll have to make a bed for them on the floor." This was done, and for the first time in my life I slept before an open fire. As I snuggled into my blankets with my face turned to the blaze, the darkness of the night and the denizens of the pineland wilderness to the north had no terrors for me. I was awakened in the early light by Uncle David building the fire, and then came my father's call, and the hurly-burly of jovial greeting from old and young. The tumult lasted till breakfast was called, and everybody who could find place sat around the table and attacked the venison and potatoes which formed the meal. I do not remember our leave-taking or the ride homeward. I bring to mind only the desolate cold of our own kitchen into which we tramped late in the afternoon, sitting in our wraps until the fire began to roar within its iron cage. Oh, winds of the winter night! Oh, firelight and the shine of tender eyes! How far away you seem tonight! So faint and far, each dear face shineth as a star. Oh, you by the western sea, and you of the south beyond the reach of Christmas snow, do not your hearts hunger, like mine tonight, for that Thanksgiving day among the trees? For the glance of eyes undimmed of tears, for the hair untouched with gray? It all lies in the unchanging realm of the past, this land of my childhood. Its charm, its strange dominion cannot return save in the poet's reminiscent dream. No money, no railway train can take us back to it. It did not in truth exist. It was a magical world, born of the vibrant union of youth and firelight, of music and the voice of moaning winds, a union which can never come again to you or me, father, uncle, brother, till the coulee meadows bloom again unscarred of spade or plow. Chapter 7. Winshike, Woods and Prairie Lands. Our last winter in the coulee was given over to preparations for our removal, but it made very little impression on my mind, which was deeply engaged on my schoolwork. As it was out of the question for us to attend the village school, the elders arranged for a neighborhood school at the home of John Roche, who had an unusually large living room. John is but a shadowy figure in this chronicle, but his daughter Indiana, whom we called Ingy, stands out as the big girl of my class. Books were scarce in this house as well as in our own. I remember piles of newspapers but no bound volumes other than the Bible and certain small Sunday school books. All the homes of the valley were equally barren. My sister and I jointly possessed a very limp and soiled cloth edition of Mother Goose. Our stories all came to us by way of the conversation of our elders. No one but Grandmother Garland ever deliberately told us a tale, except the hired girls, and their romances were of such dark and gruesome texture that we often went to bed shivering with fear of the dark. Suddenly, unexpectedly, miraculously, I came into possession of 2 books, one called Beauty and the Beast, and the other Aladdin and His Wonderful Lamp. These volumes mark a distinct epoch in my life. The grace of the lovely lady as she stood above the cringing beast gave me my first clear notion of feminine dignity and charm. On the magic flying carpet I rose into the wide air of Oriental romance. I attended the building of towered cities and the laying of gorgeous feasts. I carried in my hand the shell from which, at the word of command, the cool, clear water gushed. My feet were shod with winged boots, and on my head was the cap of invisibility. My body was captive in our snowbound little cabin, but my mind ranged the golden palaces of Persia. So much I know. Where the wonder-working romances came from I cannot now tell, but I think they were Christmas presents. For Christmas came this year with unusual splendor. The sale of the farm had put into my father's hands a considerable sum of money, and I assumed that some small part of this went to make our holiday glorious. In one of my stockings was a noble red and blue tin horse with a flowing mane and tail, and in the other was a monkey who could be made to climb a stick. Harriet had a new china doll and Frank a horn and china dog, and all the corners of our stockings were stuffed with nuts and candies. I hope Mother got something beside the potatoes and onions which I remember seeing her pull out and unwrap with delightful humor. An old and rather pathetic joke, but new to us. The snow fell deep in January, and I have many glorious pictures of the whirling flakes outlined against the darkly wooded hills across the marsh. Father was busy with his team drawing off wheat and hogs and hay, and often came into the house at night, white with the storms through which he had passed. My trips to school were often interrupted by the cold, and the path which my sister and I trod was along the ever-deepening furrows made by the bobsleighs of the farmers. Often when we met a team or were overtaken by one, we were forced out of the road into the drifts, and I can feel to this moment the wedge of snow which caught in the tops of my tall boots and slowly melted into my gray socks. We were not afraid of the drifts, however. On the contrary, Mother had to fight to keep us from wallowing beyond our depth. I had now a sled which was my inseparable companion. I could not feed the hens or bring in a pan of chips without taking it with me. My heart swelled with pride and joy whenever I regarded it, and yet it was but a sober-colored thing, a frame of hickory built by the village blacksmith in exchange for a cord of wood delivered. I took it to school one day, but Ed Roche abused it, took it up and threw it into the deep snow among the weeds. Had I been large enough, I would have killed that boy with pleasure, but being small and fat and numb with cold, I merely rescued my treasure as quickly as I could and hurried home to pour my indignant story into my mother's sympathetic ears. I seldom spoke of my defeats to my father, for he had once said, "Fight your own battles, my son. If I hear of your being licked by a boy of anything like your own size, I'll give you another when you get home." He didn't believe in mollycoddling, you will perceive. His was a stern school, the school of self-reliance and resolution. Neighbors came in now and again to talk of our migration, and yet in spite of all that, in spite of our song, in spite of my father's preparation, I had no definite premonition of coming change, and when the day of departure actually dawned, I was as surprised, as unprepared as though it had all happened without the slightest warning. So long as the kettle sang on the hearth and the clock ticked on its shelf, the idea of moving was pleasantly diverting. But when one raw winter day I saw the faithful clock stuffed with rags and laid on its back in a box, and the chairs and dishes being loaded into a big sleigh, I began to experience something very disturbing and very uncomfortable. "O'er the hills and legions, boys," did not sound so inspiring to me then. The woods and prairie lands of Iowa became of less account to me than the little cabin in which I had lived all my short life. Harriet and I wandered around, whining and shivering, our own misery augmented by the worried look on Mother's face. It was February, and she very properly resented leaving her home for a long, cold ride into an unknown world, but as a dutiful wife she worked hard and silently in packing away her treasures and clothing her children for the journey. At last the great sleigh load of bedding and furniture stood ready at the door, the stove, still warm with cheerful service, was lifted in, and the time for saying goodbye to our coolie home had come. "Forward march!" shouted Father and led the way with the big bobsled, followed by Cousin Jim and our little herd of kine, while Mother and the children brought up the rear in a pung drawn by old Josh, a flea-bit gray. It is probable that at the moment the master himself was slightly regretful. A couple of hours' march brought us to La Crosse, the great city whose wonders I had longed to confront. It stood on the bank of a wide river and had all the value of a seaport to me, for in summertime great hoarsely bellowing steamboats came and went from its quay, and all about it rose high wooded hills. Halting there, we overlooked a wide expanse of snow-covered ice in the midst of which a dark, swift, threatening current of open water ran. Across this chasm stretching from one ice field to another lay a flexible narrow bridge over which my father led the way toward hills of the western shore. There was something especially terrifying in the boiling heave of that black flood, and I shivered with terror as I passed it, having vividly in my mind certain grim stories of men whose teams had broken through and been swept beneath the ice never to reappear. It was a long ride to my mother, for she too was in terror of the ice, but at last the Minnesota bank was reached, La Crescent was passed, and our guide entering a narrow valley began to climb the snowy hills. All that was familiar was put behind. All that was strange and dark, all that was wonderful and unknown, spread out before us, and as we crawled along that slippery, slanting road, it seemed that we were entering on a new and marvelous world. We lodged that night in Hoka, a little town in a deep valley. The tavern stood near a river which flowed over its dam with resounding roar, and to its sound I slept. Next day at noon we reached Caledonia, a town high on the snowy prairie. Caledonia. For years that word was a poem in my ear, part of a marvelous and epic march. Actually, it consisted of a few frame houses and a grocery store. But no matter. Its name shall ring like a peal of bells in this book. It grew colder as we rose, and that night, the night of the second day, we reached Hesper and entered a long stretch of woods, and at last turned in towards a friendly light shining from a low house beneath a splendid oak. As we drew near, my father raised a signal shout, "Hello, the house!" and a man in a long gray coat came out. "Is that thee, friend Richard?" he called, and my father replied, "Yeah, neighbor Barley, here we are." I do not know how this stranger, whose manner of speech was so peculiar, came to be there, but he was, and in answer to my question, father replied, "Barley is a Quaker," an answer which explained nothing at that time. Being too sleepy to pursue the matter, or to remark upon anything connected with the exterior, I dumbly followed Harriet into the kitchen, which was still in possession of good Mrs. Barley. Having filled our stomachs with warm food, mother put us to bed, and when we awoke late the next day the Barleys were gone. Our own stove was in its place, and our faithful clock was ticking calmly on the shelf. So far as we knew, mother was again at home and entirely content. This farm, which was situated 2 miles west of the village of Hesper, immediately won our love. It was a glorious place for boys. Broad-armed white oaks stood about the yard, and to the east and north a deep forest invited to exploration. The house was of logs, and for that reason was much more attractive to us than to our mother. It was, I suspect, both dark and cold. I know the roof was poor, for one morning I awoke to find a miniature peak of snow on the floor at my bedside. It was only a rude little frontier cabin, but it was perfectly satisfactory to me. Harriet and I learned much in the way of woodcraft during the months which followed. Night by night the rabbits, in countless numbers, printed their telltale records in the snow, and quail and partridges nested beneath the down-drooping branches of the red oaks. Squirrels ran from tree to tree, and we were soon able to distinguish and name most of the tracks made by the birds and small animals, and we took a never-failing delight in this study of the wild. In most of my excursions my sister was my companion. My brother was too small. All my memories of this farm are of the fiber of poetry. The silence of the snowy aisles of the forest, the whirring flight of partridges, the impudent bark of squirrels, the quavering voices of owls and coons, the music of the winds in the high trees. All these impressions unite in my mind like parts of a woodland symphony. I soon learned to distinguish the raccoon's mournful call from the quavering cry of the owl, and I joined the hired man in hunting rabbits from under the piles of brush in the clearing. Once or twice some ferocious, larger animal, possibly a panther, hungrily yowled in the impenetrable thickets to the north, but this only lent a still more enthralling interest to the forest. To the east, An hour's walk through the timber, stood the village, built and named by the friends who had a meeting house not far away, and though I saw much of them, I never attended their services. Our closest neighbor was a gruff, loud-voiced old Norwegian, and from his children, our playmates, we learned many curious facts. All Norwegians, it appeared, ate from wooden plates or wooden bowls. Their food was soup which they called bean swagen, and they were all yellow-haired and blue-eyed. Harriet and I and one Lars Peterson gave a great deal of time to an attempt to train a yoke of yearling calves to draw our handsled. I call it an attempt, for we hardly got beyond a struggle to overcome the stubborn resentment of the stupid beasts, who very naturally objected to being forced into service before their time. Harriet was 10, I was not quite 9, and Lars was only 12. Hence we spent long hours in yoking and unyoking our unruly span. I believe we did actually haul several loads of firewood to the kitchen door, but at last Buck and Bryn turned the yoke and broke it, and that ended our teaming. The man from whom we acquired our farm had in some way domesticated a flock of wild geese, and though they must have been a part of the farmyard during the winter, they made no deep impression on my mind till in the spring when, as the migratory instinct stirred in their blood, they all rose on the surface of the water in a little pool near the barn, and with beating wings lifted their voices in brazen clamor, calling to their fellows driving by high overhead. At times their cries halted the flocks in their arrowy flight and brought them down to mix indistinguishably with the captive birds. The wings of these had been clipped, but as the weeks went on their pinions grew again, and one morning when I went out to see what had happened to them, I found the pool empty and silent. We all missed their fine voices, and yet we could not blame them for a reassertion of their freeborn nature. They had gone back to their summer camping grounds on the lakes of the far north. Early in April my father hired a couple of raw Norwegians to assist in clearing the land, and although neither of these immigrants could speak a word of English, I was greatly interested in them. They slept in the granary, but this did not prevent them from communicating to our housemaid a virulent case of smallpox. Several days passed before my mother realized what ailed the girl. The discovery must have horrified her, for she had been through an epidemic of this dread disease in Wisconsin, and knew its danger. It was a fearsome plague in those days, much more fatal than now, and my mother with 3 unvaccinated children, a helpless handmaid to be nursed, was in despair when father developed the disease and took to his bed. Surely it must have seemed to her as though the Lord had visited upon her more punishment than belonged to her, for to add the final touch, in the midst of all her other afflictions she was expecting the birth of another child. I do not know what we would have done had not a noble woman of the neighborhood volunteered to come in and help us. She was not a friend, hardly an acquaintance, and yet she served us like an angel of mercy. Whether she still lives or not I cannot say, but I wish to acknowledge here the splendid heroism which brought Mary Briggs, a stranger, into our stricken home at a time when all our other neighbors beat their horses into a mad gallop whenever forced to pass our gate. Young as I was, I realized something of the burden which had fallen upon my mother, and when one night I was awakened from deep sleep by hearing her calling out in pain, begging piteously for help, I shuddered in my bed, realizing with childish, intuitive knowledge that she was passing through a cruel convulsion which could not be softened or put aside. I went to sleep again at last, and when I woke, I had a little sister. Harriet and I, having been vaccinated, escaped with what was called the verilide, but father was ill for several weeks. Fortunately he was spared, as we all were, the pitting which usually follows this dreaded disease, and in a week or two we children had forgotten all about it. Spring was upon us and the world was waiting to be explored. One of the noblest features of this farm was a large spring which boiled forth from the limestone rock about 80 rods north of the house, and this was a wonder spot to us. There was something magical in this never-failing fountain, and we loved to play beside its waters. One of our delightful tasks was riding the horses to water at this spring, and I took many lessons in horsemanship on these trips. As the seeding time came on, enormous flocks of pigeons, in clouds which almost filled the sky, made it necessary for someone to sentinel the new-sown grain, and although I was but 9 years of age, my father put a double-barreled shotgun into my hands and sent me out to defend the fields. This commission filled me with the spirit of the soldier. Proudly walking my rounds, I menaced the flocks as they circled warily over my head, taking shot at them now and again as they came near enough, feeling as duty-bound and as martial as any Roman sentry standing guard over a city. Up to this time I had not been allowed to carry arms, although I had been the companion of Den Green and Ellis Usher on their hunting expeditions in the coulee. Now, with entire discretion over my weapon, I loaded it, capped it and fired it, marching with sedate and manly tread, while little Frank at my heels served as subordinate in his turn. The pigeons passed after a few days, but my warlike duties continued, for the ground squirrels, called gophers by the settlers, were almost as destructive of the seed corn as the pigeons had been of the wheat. Day after day I patrolled the edge of the field listening to the saucy whistle of the striped little rascals, tracking them to their burrows and shooting them as they lifted their heads above the ground. I had moments of being sorry for them, but the sight of one digging up the seed silenced my complaining conscience, and I continued to slay. The schoolhouse of this district stood out upon the prairie to the west a mile distant, and during May we trudged our way over a pleasant road, each carrying a small tin pail filled with luncheon. Here I came in contact with the Norwegian boys from the colony to the north, and a bitter feud arose or existed between the Yankees, as they called us, and the Norskies, as we called them. Often when we met on the road, showers of sticks and stones filled the air, and our hearts burned with the heat of savage conflict. War usually broke out at the moment of parting. Often after a fairly amicable half-mile together we suddenly split into hostile ranks, and warred with true tribal frenzy as long as we could find a stone or a clod to serve as missile. I had no personal animosity in this. I was merely a Pict willing to destroy my Angle enemies. As I look back upon my life on that woodland farm, it all seems very colorful and sweet. I am reliving days when the warm sun, falling on radiant slopes of grass, lit the meadow phlox and tall tiger lilies into flaming torches of color. I think of blackberry thickets and odorous grapevines and cherry trees and the delicious nuts which grew in profusion throughout the forest to the north. This forest, which seemed endless and was of enchanted solemnity, served as our wilderness. We explored it at every opportunity. We loved every day for the color it brought, each season for the wealth of its experience, and we welcomed the thought of spending all our years in this beautiful home where the wood and the prairie of our song did actually meet and mingle. Chapter 8. We move again. One day there came into our home a strange man who spoke in a fashion new to me. He was a middle-aged, rather formal individual, dressed in a rough gray suit, and father alluded to him privately as that English Duke. I didn't know exactly what he meant by this, but our visitor's talk gave me a vague notion of the old country. "My home," he said, "is near Manchester. I have come to try farming in the American wilderness." He was kindly and did his best to be democratic, but we children stood away from him, wondering what he was doing in our house. My mother disliked him from the start as he took his seat at our dinner table. He drew from his pocket a case in which he carried a silver fork and spoon and a silver-handled knife. Our cutlery was not good enough for him. Every family that we knew at that time used 3-tine steel forks, and my mother naturally resented the implied criticism of her tableware. I heard her say to my father, "If our ways don't suit your English friend, he'd better go somewhere else for his meals." This fastidious pioneer also carried a revolver, for he believed that having penetrated far into a dangerous country, he was in danger, and I am not at all sure but that he was right, for the Minnesota woods at this time were filled with horse thieves and counterfeiters, and it was known that many of these land-hunting Englishmen carried large sums of gold on their persons. We resented our guest still more when we found that he was trying to buy our lovely farm, and that father was already half persuaded. We loved this farm. We loved the log house and the oaks which sheltered it, and we especially valued the glorious spring and the plum trees which stood near it. But father was still dreaming of the free lands of the farther west, and early in March he sold to the Englishmen and moved us all to a rented place some 6 miles directly west, in the township of Burr Oak. This was but a temporary lodging, a kind of camping place, for no sooner were his fields seeded than he set forth once again with a covered wagon, eager to explore the open country to the north and west of us. The wood and prairie land of Winshike County did not satisfy him, although it seemed to me then, as it does now, the fulfillment of his vision, the realization of our song. For several weeks he traveled through southern Minnesota and northern Iowa, always in search of the perfect farm, and when he returned just before harvest, he was able to report that he had purchased a quarter section of the best land in Mitchell County, and that after harvest we would all move again. If my mother resented this third removal, she made no comment which I can now recall. I suspect that she went rather willingly this time, for her brother David wrote that he had also located in Mitchell County, not 2 miles from the place my father had decided upon for our future home, and Samantha, her younger sister, had settled in Minnesota. The circle in Neshonoc seemed about to break up. A mighty spreading and shifting was going on all over the West, and no doubt my mother accepted her part in it without a special protest. Our life in Burr Oak Township that summer was joyous for us children. It seems to have been almost all sunshine and play. As I reflect upon it, I relive many delightful excursions into the northern woods. It appears that Harriet and I were in continual harvest of nuts and berries. Our walks to school were explorations, and we spent nearly every Saturday and Sunday in minute study of the countryside, devouring everything which was remotely edible. We gorged upon May-apples until we were ill, and munched black cherries until we were dizzy with their fumes. We clambered high trees to collect baskets of wild grapes which our mother could not use, and we garnered nuts with the insatiable greed of squirrels. We ate oak shoots, fern roots, leaves, bark, seed balls, everything. Not because we were hungry, but because we loved to experiment, and we came home, only when hungry or worn out or in awe of the darkness. It was a delightful season, full of the most satisfying companionship, and yet of the names of my playmates I can seize upon only 2. The others have faded from the tablets of my memory. I remember Ned, who permitted me to hold his plow, and Perry, who taught me how to tame the half-wild colts that filled his father's pasture. Together we spent long days lassoing, or rather snaring, the feet of these horses and subduing them to the halter. We had many fierce struggles, but came out of them all without a serious injury. Late in August my father again loaded our household goods into wagons, and with our small herd of cattle following, set out toward the west, bound once again to overtake the actual line of the middle border. This journey has an unforgettable epic charm as I look back upon it. Each mile took us farther and farther into the unsettled prairie until in the afternoon of the second day, we came to a meadow so wide that its western rim touched the sky without revealing a sign of man's habitation other than the road in which we traveled. The plain was covered with grass tall as ripe wheat, and when my father stopped his team and came back to us and said, "Well, children, here we are on the big prairie," we looked about us with awe, so endless seemed this spread of wild oats and waving blue joint. Far away dim clumps of trees showed, but no chimney was in sight, and no living thing moved save our own cattle and the hawks lazily wheeling in the air. My heart filled with awe as well as wonder. The majesty of this primeval world exalted me. I felt for the first time the poetry of the unplowed spaces. It seemed that the herds of deer and buffalo of our song might, at any moment, present themselves. But they did not, and my father took no account even of the marsh fowl. "Forward march!" he shouted, and on we went. Hour after hour he pushed into the west, the heads of his tired horses hanging ever lower, and on my mother's face the shadow deepened, but her chieftain's voice cheerily urging his team lost nothing of its clarion resolution. He was in his element. He loved this shelterless sweep of prairie. This westward march entranced him. I think he would have gladly kept on until the snowy wall of the Rocky Mountains met his eyes, for he was a natural explorer. Sunset came at last, but still he drove steadily on through the sparse settlements. Just at nightfall we came to a beautiful little stream, and stopped to let the horses drink. I heard its rippling, reassuring song on the pebbles. Thereafter all is dim and vague to me until my mother called out sharply, "Wake up, children! Here we are." Struggling to my feet, I looked about me. Nothing could be seen but the dim form of a small house. On every side the land melted into blackness, silent and without boundary. Driving into the yard, Father hastily unloaded one of the wagons and taking Mother and Harriet and Jessie drove away to spend the night with Uncle David, who had preceded us, as I now learned, and was living on a farm not far away. My brother and I were left to camp as best we could with the hired man. Spreading a rude bed on the floor, he told us to hop in, and in 10 minutes we were all fast asleep. The sound of a clattering poker awakened me next morning, and when I opened my sleepy eyes and looked out, a new world displayed itself before me. The cabin faced a level plain with no tree in sight. A mile away to the west stood a low stone house, and immediately in front of us opened a half-section of unfenced sod. To the north, as far as I could see, the land billowed like a russet ocean, with scarcely a roof to fleck its lonely spread. I cannot say that I liked or disliked it. I merely marveled at it, and while I wandered about the yard, the hired man scorched some cornmeal mush in a skillet, and this, with some butter and gingerbread, made up my first breakfast in Mitchell County. An hour or two later, father and mother and the girls returned, and the work of setting up the stove and getting the furniture in place began. In a very short time, the experienced clock was voicing its contentment on a new shelf, and the kettle was singing busily on its familiar stove. Once more, and for the 6th time since her marriage, Belle Garland adjusted herself to a pioneer environment, comforted no doubt by the knowledge that David and Deborah were near and that her father was coming soon. No doubt she also congratulated herself on the fact that she had not been carried beyond the Missouri River, and that her house was not surrounded by Indians who murder by night. A few hours later, while my brother and I were on the roof of the house with intent to peer over the edge of the prairie, something grandly significant happened. Upon a low hill to the west, a herd of horses suddenly appeared running swiftly, led by a beautiful sorrel pony with shining white mane. On they came, like a platoon of cavalry rushing down across the open sod which lay before our door. The leader moved with lofty and graceful action, easily outstretching all his fellows. Forward they swept, their long tails floating in the wind like banners. On in a great curve as if scenting danger in the smoke of our fire. The thunder of their feet filled me with delight. Surely, next to a herd of buffalo, this squadron of wild horses was the most satisfactory evidence of the wilderness into which we had been thrust. Riding as if to intercept the leader, a solitary herder now appeared, mounted upon a horse which very evidently was the mate of the leader. He rode magnificently, and under him the lithe mare strove resolutely to overtake and head off the leader, all to no purpose. The halterless steeds of the prairie snorted derisively at their former companion, bridled and saddled, and carrying the weight of a master. Swiftly they thundered across the sod, dropped into a ravine, and disappeared in a cloud of dust. Silently we watched the rider turn and ride slowly homeward. The plain had become our new domain, the horseman our ideal. Chapter 9. Our first winter on the prairie. For a few days my brother and I had little to do other than to keep the cattle from straying, and we used our leisure in becoming acquainted with the region round about. It burned deep into our memories, this wide, sunny, windy country. The sky so big, and the horizon line so low and so far away, made this new world of the plain more majestic than the world of the coulee. The grasses and many of the flowers were also new to us. On the uplands the herbage was short and dry and the plants stiff and woody, but in the swales the wild oat shook its quivers of barbed and twisted arrows, and the crow's foot, tall and sere, bowed softly under the feet of the wind, while everywhere, in the lowlands as well as on the ridges, the bleaching white antlers of bygone herbivora lay scattered, testifying to the herds of deer and buffalo which once fed there. We were just a few years too late to see them. To the south the sections were nearly all settled upon, for in that direction lay the county town, but to the north and on into Minnesota rolled the unplowed sod, the feeding ground of the cattle, the home of foxes and wolves, and to the west, just beyond the highest ridges, we loved to think the bison might still be seen. The cabin on this rented farm was a mere shanty, a shell of pine boards, which needed reinforcing to make it habitable, and one day my father said, "Well, Hamlin, I guess you'll have to run the plow team this fall. I must help neighbor Button wall up the house, and I can't afford to hire another man." This seemed a fine commission for a lad of 10, and I drove my horses into the field that first morning with a manly pride which added an inch to my stature. I took my initial round at a land which stretched from one side of the quarter section to the other, in confident mood. I was grown up, but alas, my sense of elation did not last long. To guide a team for a few minutes as an experiment was one thing, to plow all day like a hired hand was another. It was not a chore, it was a job. It meant moving to and fro hour after hour, day after day, with no one to talk to but the horses. It meant trudging 8 or 9 miles in the forenoon and as many more in the afternoon, with less than an hour off at noon. It meant dragging the heavy implement around the corners, and it meant also many shipwrecks, for the thick, wet stubble matted with wild buckwheat often rolled up between the coulter and the standard and threw the share completely out of the ground, making it necessary for me to halt the team and jerk the heavy plow backward for a new start. Although strong and active I was rather short, even for a 10-year-old, and to reach the plow handles I was obliged to lift my hands above my shoulders. And so, with the guiding lines crossed over my back and my worn straw hat bobbing just above the crossbrace, I must have made a comical figure. At any rate, nothing like it had been seen in the neighborhood, and the people on the road to town looking across the field laughed and called to me, and neighbor Button said to my father in my hearing, "That chap's too young to run a plow," a judgment which pleased and flattered me greatly. Harriet cheered me by running out occasionally to meet me as I turned the nearest corner, and sometimes Frank consented to go all the way around, chatting breathlessly as he trotted along behind. At other times he was prevailed upon to bring to me a cookie and a glass of milk, a deed which helped to shorten the forenoon. And yet, notwithstanding all these ameliorations, plowing became tedious. The flies were savage, especially in the middle of the day, and the horses, tortured by their lances, drove badly, twisting and turning in their despairing rage. Their tails were continually getting over the lines, and in stopping to kick their tormentors from their bellies they often got astride the traces, and in other ways made trouble for me. Only in the early morning or when the sun sank low at night were they able to move quietly along their ways. The soil was the kind my father had been seeking, a smooth, dark, sandy loam, which made it possible for a lad to do the work of a man. Often the share would go the entire round without striking a root or a pebble as big as a walnut, the steel running steadily with a crisp, crunching, ripping sound which I rather liked to hear. In truth, work would have been quite tolerable had it not been so long drawn out. 10 hours of it, even on a fine day, made about twice too many for a boy. Meanwhile, I cheered myself in every imaginable way. I whistled. I sang. I studied the clouds. I gnawed the beautiful red skin from the seed vessels which hung upon the wild rose bushes, and I counted the prairie chickens as they began to come together in winter flocks running through the stubble in search of food. I stopped now and again to examine the lizards unhoused by the share, tormenting them to make them sweat their milky drops. They were curiously repulsive to me. And I measured the little granaries of wheat which the mice and gophers had deposited deep under the ground, storehouses which the plow had violated. My eyes dwelt enviously upon the sailing hawk and on the passing of ducks. The occasional shadowy figure of a prairie wolf made me wish for Uncle David and his rifle. On certain days nothing could cheer me. When the bitter wind blew from the north, and the sky was filled with wild geese racing southward, with swiftly hurrying clouds, winter seemed about to spring upon me. The horses' tails streamed in the wind. Flurries of snow covered me with clinging flakes, and the mud gummed my boots and trouser legs, clogging my steps. At such times I suffered from cold and loneliness. All sense of being a man evaporated. I was just a little boy, longing for the leisure of boyhood. Day after day, through the month of October and deep into November, I followed that team, turning over 2 acres of stubble each day. I would not believe this without proof, but it is true. At last it grew so cold that in the early morning everything was white with frost, and I was obliged to put one hand in my pocket to keep it warm, while holding the plow with the other, but I didn't mind this so much, for it hinted at the close of autumn. I've no doubt facing the wind in this way was excellent discipline, but I didn't think it necessary then, and my heart was sometimes bitter and rebellious. The soldier did not intend to be severe. As he had always been an early riser and a busy toiler, it seemed perfectly natural and good discipline that his sons should also plow and husk corn at 10 years of age. He often told of beginning life as a bound boy at 9, and these stories helped me to perform my own tasks without whining. I feared to voice my weakness. At last there came a morning when, by striking my heel upon the ground, I convinced my boss that the soil was frozen too deep for the moldboard to break. "All right," he said. "You may lay off this forenoon." Oh, those beautiful hours of respite! With time to play or read, I usually read, devouring anything I could lay my hands upon. Newspapers, whether old or new, or pasted on the wall or piled up in the attic. Anything in print was wonderful to me. One enthralling book, borrowed from neighbor Button, was The Female Spy, a tale of the rebellion. Another treasure was a story called Cast Ashore, but this volume unfortunately was badly torn and 50 pages were missing, so that I never knew, and do not know to this day, how those indomitable shipwrecked seamen reached their English homes. I dimly recall that one man carried a pet monkey on his back, and that they all lived on bustards. Finally the day came when the ground rang like iron under the feet of the horses, and a bitter wind, raw and gusty, swept out of the northwest, bearing gray veils of sleet. Winter had come, Work in the furrow had ended. The plow was brought in, cleaned and greased to prevent its rusting, and while the horses munched their hay in well-earned holiday, Father and I helped Farmer Button husk the last of his corn. Osmond Button, a quaint and interesting man of middle age, was a native of York State and retained many of the traditions of his old home, strangely blent with a store of vivid memories of Colorado, Utah, and California, for he had been one of the gold seekers of the early 50s. He loved to spin yarns of "when I was in gold camps," and he spun them well. He was short and bent and spoke in a low voice with a curious nervous sniff, but his diction was notably precise and clear. He was a man of judgment, and a citizen of weight and influence. From O. Button I got my first definite notion of Bret Harte's country, and of the long journey which they of the Ox team had made in search of El Dorado. His family, mostly boys and girls, was large, yet they all lived in a low limestone house which he had built, he said, to serve as a granary till he should find time to erect a suitable dwelling. In order to make the point dramatic, I will say that he was still living in the granary when last I called on him 30 years later. A warm friendship sprang up between him and my father, and he was often at our house, but his gaunt and silent wife seldom accompanied him. She was kindly and hospitable, but a great sufferer. She never laughed and seldom smiled, and so remains a pathetic figure in all my memories of the household. The younger Button children, Eva and Cyrus, became our companions in certain of our activities, but as they were both very sedate and slow of motion, they seldom joined us in our livelier sports. They were both much older than their years. Cyrus at this time was almost as venerable as his father, although his years were, I suppose, about 17. Albert and Lavinia, we heard, were much given to dancing and parties. One night, as we were all seated around the kerosene lamp, my father said, "Well, Belle, I suppose we'll have to take these young ones down to town and fit 'em out for school." These words, so calmly uttered, filled our minds with visions of new boots, new caps, and new books, and though we went obediently to bed, we hardly slept, so excited were we, and at breakfast next morning not one of us could think of food. All our desires converged upon the wondrous expedition, our first visit to town. Our only carriage was still the lumber wagon, but it had now 2 spring seats, one for Father, Mother, and Jessie, and one for Harriet, Frank, and myself. No one else had anything better, hence we had no sense of being poorly outfitted. We drove away across the frosty prairie toward Osage, moderately comfortable and perfectly happy. Osage was only a little town, a village of perhaps 1,200 inhabitants, but to me, as we drove down its main street, it was almost as impressive as La Crosse had been. Frank clung close to Father, and Mother led Jessie, leaving Harriet and me to stumble over nail kegs and dodge whiffle trees what time our eyes absorbed jars of pink and white candy, and sought out boots and buckskin mittens. Whenever Harriet spoke, she whispered, and we pointed at each shining object with cautious care. Oh, the marvelous exotic smells, odors of salt codfish and spices, calico and kerosene, apples and ginger snaps mingle in my mind as I write. Each of us soon carried a candy marble in his or her cheek, as a chipmunk carries a nut, and Frank and I stood like sturdy hitching posts whilst the storekeeper with heavy hands screwed cotton plush caps upon our heads. But the most exciting moment, the crowning joy of the day, came with the buying of our new boots. If only Father had not insisted on our taking those which were a size too large for us. They were real boots. No one but a congressman wore gaiters in those days. War fashions still dominated the shoe shops, and high-topped cavalry boots were all but universal. They were kept in boxes under the counter or ranged in rows on a shelf and were of all weights and degrees of fineness. The ones I selected had red tops with a golden moon in the center, but my brother's taste ran to blue tops decorated with a golden flag. Oh, that deliciously oily new smell! My heart glowed every time I looked at mine. I was especially pleased because they did not have copper toes. Copper toes belonged to little boys. A youth who had plowed 70 acres of land could not reasonably be expected to dress like a child. How smooth and delightfully stiff they felt on my feet. Then came our new books, a McGuffey reader, a Mitchell geography, a Ray's arithmetic, and a slate. The books had a delightful new smell also, and there was singular charm in the smooth surface of the unmarked slates. I was eager to carve my name in the frame. At last, with our treasures under the seat, so near that we could feel them. With our slates and books in our laps, we jolted home, dreaming of school and snow. To wade in the drifts with our fine high-topped boots was now our desire. It is strange, but I cannot recall how my mother looked on this trip. Even my father's image is faint and vague. I remember only his keen, eagle-gray, terrifying eyes. But I can see every acre of that rented farm. I can tell you exactly how the house looked. It was an unpainted square cottage and stood bare on the sod at the edge of Dry Run Ravine. It had a small lean-to on the eastern side and a sitting room and bedroom below. Overhead was a low, unplastered chamber in which we children slept. As it grew too cold to use the summer kitchen, we cooked, ate, and lived in the square room which occupied the entire front of the two-story upright, and which was, I suppose, 16 feet square. As our attic was warmed only by the stovepipe, we older children of a frosty morning made extremely simple and hurried toilets. On very cold days we hurried downstairs to dress beside the kitchen fire. Our furniture was of the rudest sort. I cannot recall a single piece in our house or in our neighbors' houses that had either beauty or distinction. It was all cheap and worn, for this was the middle border, and nearly all our neighbors had moved as we had done in covered wagons. Farms were new, houses were mere shanties, and money was scarce. War times and war prices were only just beginning to change. Our clothing was all cheap and ill-fitting. The women and children wore homemade cotton flannel underclothing for the most part, and the men wore rough, ready-made suits over which they drew brown denim blouses or overalls to keep them clean. Father owned a fine buffalo overcoat, so much of his song's promise was redeemed, and we possessed 2 buffalo robes for use in our winter sleigh, but Mother had only a sad coat and a woolen shawl. How she kept warm I cannot now understand. I think she stayed at home on cold days. All of the boys wore long trousers, and even my 8-year-old brother looked like a miniature man with his full-length overalls, high-topped boots, and real suspenders. As for me, I carried a bandana in my hip pocket and walked with determined masculine stride. My mother, like all her brothers and sisters, was musical and played the violin, or fiddle as we called it, and I have many dear remembrances of her playing. Napoleon's March, Money Musk, The Devil's Dream, and half a dozen other simple tunes made up her repertoire. It was very crude music, of course, but it added to the love and admiration in which her children always held her. Also, in some way we had fallen heir to a Prince melodeon, one that had belonged to the McClintocks, but only my sister played on that. Once at a dance in neighbor Button's house, Mother took the dare of the fiddler and with shy smile played the Fisher's hornpipe or some other simple melody, and was mightily cheered at the close of it. A brief performance which she refused to repeat. Afterward she and my father danced, and this seemed a very wonderful performance, for to us they were old, far past such frolicking, although he was but 40 and she 31. At this dance I heard, for the first time, the local professional fiddler, Old Daddy Fairbanks, as quaint a character as ever entered fiction. For he was not only butcher and horse doctor but a renowned musician as well. Tall, gaunt, and sandy, with enormous nose and sparse projecting teeth. He was to me the most enthralling figure at this dance, and his queer calls, and his York State accent filled us all with delight. Ally man left, chasse by your partners, dozy-do were some of the phrases he used as he played Honest John and Haste to the Wedding. At times he sang his calls in high nasal chant. First lady lead to the right, deedle, deedle, dum-dum, gent faller after, dally-deedle-doo-doo, 3 hands round. And everybody laughed with frank enjoyment of his words and action. It was a joy to watch him start the set. With fiddle under his chin, he took his seat in a big chair on the kitchen table in order to command the floor. Farm on, he called disgustedly. Lively now! And then, when all the couples were in position, with one mighty number 14 boot uplifted, with bow laid to strings he snarled, Already jalang! And with a thundering crash his foot came down. Honors to W your partners, right and left for, and the dance was on. I suspect his fiddlin' was not even middlin', but he beat time fairly well and kept the dancers somewhere near to rhythm, and so when his ragged old cap went round he often got a handful of quarters for his toil. He always ate 2 suppers, one at the beginning of the party and another at the end. He had a high respect for the skill of my Uncle David and was grateful to him and other better musicians for their non-interference with his professional engagements. The schoolhouse, which was to be the center of our social life, stood on the bare prairie about a mile to the southwest, and like thousands of other similar buildings in the west, had not a leaf to shade it in summer nor a branch to break the winds of savage winter. There's been a good deal of talk about setting out a windbreak, neighbor Button explained to us, but nothing has as yet been done. It was merely a square pine box painted a glaring white on the outside and a desolate drab within. At least drab was the original color, but the benches were mainly so greasy and hacked that original intentions were obscured. It had 2 doors on the eastern end and 3 windows on each side. A long square stove, standing on slender legs in a puddle of bricks, a wooden chair and a rude table in one corner, for the use of the teacher, completed the movable furniture. The walls were roughly plastered and the windows had no curtains. It was a barren temple of the arts even to the residents of Dry Run, and Harriet and I, stealing across the prairie one Sunday morning to look in, came away vaguely depressed. We were fond of school and never missed a day if we could help it, but this neighborhood center seemed small and bleak and poor. With what fear, what excitement we approached the door on that first day, I can only faintly indicate. All the scholars were strange to me except Albert and Cyrus Button, and I was prepared for rough treatment. However, the experience was not so harsh as I had feared. True, Rangeley Field did throw me down and wash my face in snow, and Jack Sweet tripped me up once or twice, but I bore these indignities with such grace and could command, and soon made a place for myself among the boys. Burton Babcock was my seatmate, and at once became my chum. You will hear much of him in this chronicle. He was 2 years older than I, and though pale and slim was unusually swift and strong for his age. He was a silent lad, curiously timid in his classes and not at ease with his teachers. I cannot recover much of that first winter of school. It was not an experience to remember for its charm. Not one line of grace, not one touch of color relieved the room's bare walls or softened its harsh windows. Perhaps this very barrenness gave to the poetry in our readers an appeal that seems magical. Certainly it threw over the faces of Frances Babcock and Mary Abby Gammons a lovelier halo. They were the big girls of the school, that is to say, they were 17 or 18 years old. And Frances was the special terror of the teacher, a pale and studious pigeon-toed young man who was preparing for college. In spite of the cold, the boys played open-air games all winter. Dog and deer, dare gull and fox and geese were our favorite diversions, and the wonder is that we did not all die of pneumonia, for we battled so furiously during each recess that we often came in wet with perspiration and coughing so hard that for several minutes recitations were quite impossible. But we were a hardy lot and none of us seemed the worse for our colds. There was not much chivalry in the school, quite the contrary, for it was dominated by 2 or 3 big rough boys and the rest of us took our tone from them. To protect a girl, to shield her from remark or indignity required a good deal of bravery, and few of us were strong enough to do it. Girls were foolish, ridiculous creatures, set apart to be laughed at or preyed upon at will. To shame them was a great joke. How far I shared in these barbarities I cannot say, but that I did share in them I know, for I had very little to do with my sister Harriet after crossing the schoolhouse yard. She kept to her tribe as I to mine. This winter was made memorable also by a revival, which came over the district with sudden fury. It began late in the winter, fortunately, for it ended all dancing and merrymaking for the time. It silenced Daddy Fairbank's fiddle and subdued my mother's glorious voice to a wail. A cloud of puritanical gloom settled upon almost every household. Youth and love became furtive and hypocritic. The evangelist, one of the old-fashioned shouting, hysterical, ungrammatical, gasping sort, took charge of the services, and in his exhortations phrases descriptive of lakes of burning brimstone and ages of endless torment abounded. Some of the figures of speech and violent gestures of the man still linger in my mind, but I will not set them down on paper. They are too dreadful to perpetuate. At times he roared with such power that he could have been heard for half a mile. And yet we went, night by night, mother, father, Jessie, all of us. It was our theater. Some of the roughest characters in the neighborhood rose and professed repentance. For a season, even old Barton, the profanest man in the township, experienced a change of heart. We all enjoyed the singing, and joined most lustily in the tunes. Even little Jessie learned to sing Heavenly Wings, There is a Fountain Filled with Blood, and Old Hundred. As I peer back into that crowded little schoolroom, smothering hot and reeking with lamp smoke, and recall the half-lit, familiar faces of the congregation, it all has the quality of a vision, something experienced in another world. The preacher, leaping, sweating, roaring till the windows rattle, the mothers with sleeping babes in their arms, the sweet, strained faces of the girls, the immobile wondering men, are spectral shadows, figures encountered in the phantasmagoria of disordered sleep. Chapter 10. The Homestead on the Knoll. Spring came to us that year with such sudden beauty, such sweet significance after our long and depressing winter, that it seemed a release from prison, and when at the close of a warm day in March we heard, pulsing down through the golden haze of sunset, the mellow boom, boom, boom of the prairie cock, our hearts quickened. For this, we were told, was the certain sign of spring. Day by day the call of this gay herald of spring was taken up by others until at last the whole horizon was ringing with a sunrise symphony of exultant song. Boom, 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 called the roosters. Cutta, cutta, wah-whoop, squaw, squawk, answered the hens as they fluttered and danced on the ridges, and mingled with their jocund we heard at last the slender, wistful piping of the prairie lark. With the coming of spring my duties as a teamster returned. My father put me in charge of a harrow, and with old Doll and Queen, quiet and faithful span, I drove upon the field which I had plowed the previous October, there to plod to and fro behind my drag, while in the sky above my head and around me on the mellowing soil the life of the season thickened. Aided by my team, I was able to study at close range the prairie roosters as they assembled for their parade. They had regular stamping grounds on certain ridges, where the soil was beaten smooth by the pressure of their restless feet. I often passed within a few yards of them. I can see them now, the cocks leaping and strutting, with trailing wings and down-thrust heads, displaying their bulbous orange-colored neck ornaments while the hens flutter and squawk in silly delight. All the charm and mystery of that prairie world comes back to me, and I ache with an illogical desire to recover it and hold it, and preserve it in some form for my children. It seems an injustice that they should miss it, and yet it is probable that they are getting an equal joy of life, an equal exultation from the opening flowers of the single lilac bush in our city backyard, or from an occasional visit to the lake in Central Park. Dragging is even more wearisome than plowing in some respects, for you have no handles to assist you, and your heels sinking deep into the soft loam bring such unwanted strain upon the tendons of your legs that you can scarcely limp home to supper, and it seems that you cannot possibly go on another day. But you do, at least I did. There was something relentless as the weather in the way my soldier father ruled his sons. And yet he was neither hard-hearted nor unsympathetic. The fact is easily explained. His own boyhood had been task-filled, and he saw nothing unnatural in the regular employment of his children. Having had little playtime himself, he considered that we were having a very comfortable boyhood. Furthermore, the country was new and labor scarce. Every hand and foot must count under such conditions. There are certain ameliorations to child labor on a farm. Air and sunshine and food are plentiful. I never lacked for meat or clothing, and mingled with my records of toil are exquisite memories of the joy I took in following the changes in the landscape, in the notes of birds, and in the play of small animals on the sunny soil. There were no pigeons on the prairie, but enormous flocks of ducks came sweeping northward, alighting at sunset to feed in the fields of stubble. They came in countless myriads, and often when they settled to earth they covered acres of meadow like some prodigious cataract from the sky. When alarmed they rose with a sound like the rumbling of thunder. At times the lines of their cloud-like flocks were so unending that those in the front rank were lost in the northern sky, while those in the rear were but dim bands beneath the southern sun. I tried many times to shoot some of them, but never succeeded, so wary were they. Brant and geese in formal flocks followed, and to watch these noble birds pushing their arrowy lines straight into the north always gave me special joy. On fine days they flew high, so high they were but faint lines against the shining clouds. I learned to imitate their cries, and often caused the leaders to turn, to waver in their course as I uttered my resounding call. The sandhill crane came last of all, loitering north in lonely, easeful flight. Often of a warm day, I heard his sovereign cry falling from the azure dome, so high, so far his form could not be seen, so close to the sun that my eyes could not detect his solitary, majestic circling sweep. He came after the geese. He was the herald of summer. His brazen, reverberating call will forever remain associated in my mind with mellow, pulsating earth, springing grass, and cloudless, glorious Maytime skies. As my team moved to and fro over the field, Ground sparrows rose in countless thousands, flinging themselves against the sky like grains of wheat from out a sower's hand, and their chatter fell upon me like the voices of fairy sprites, invisible and multitudinous. Long, swift, narrow flocks of a bird we called the prairie pigeon swooped over the swells on sounding wing, winding so close to the ground, they seemed at times like slender airborne serpents, and always the brown lark whistled as if to cheer my lonely task. Back and forth across the wide field I drove, while the sun crawled slowly up the sky. It was tedious work, and I was always hungry by 9 and famished at 10. Thereafter the sun appeared to stand still. My chest caved in and my knees trembled with weakness, but when at last the white flag fluttering from a chamber window summoned to the midday meal, I started with strength miraculously renewed and called, "Dinner!" to the hired hand. Unhitching my team, with eager haste I climbed upon Old Queen and rode at ease toward the barn. Oh, it was good to enter the kitchen, odorous with fresh biscuit and hot coffee. We all ate like dragons, devouring potatoes and salt pork without end, till Mother mildly remarked, "Boys, boys, don't founder yourselves." From such a meal I withdrew torpid as a gorged snake, but luckily I had half an hour in which to get my courage back. And besides, there was always the stirring power of Father's clarion call. His energy appeared superhuman to me. I was in awe of him. He kept track of everything, seemed hardly to sleep, and never complained of weariness. Long before the nooning was up, or so it seemed to me, he began to shout, "Time's up, boys. Grab a root." And so, lame, stiff and sore, with the sinews of my legs shortened, so that my knees were bent like an old man's, I hobbled away to the barn and took charge of my team. Once in the field, I felt better. A subtle change, a mellower charm came over the afternoon earth. The ground was warmer, the sky more genial, the wind more amiable, and before I had finished my second round my joints were moderately pliable and my sinews relaxed. Nevertheless, the temptation to sit on the corner of the harrow and dream the moments away was very great, and sometimes as I laid my tired body down on the tawny, sunlit grass at the edge of the field, and gazed up at the beautiful clouds sailing by, I wished for leisure to explore their purple valleys. The wind whispered in the tall weeds, and sighed in the hazel bushes. The dried blades touching one another in the passing winds, spoke to me, and the gophers, glad of escape from their dark, underground prisons, chirped a cheery greeting. Such respites were strangely sweet. So day by day, as I walked my monotonous round upon the ever-mellowing soil, the prairie spring unrolled its beauties before me. I saw the last goose pass on to the north, and watched the green grass creeping up the sunny slopes. I answered the splendid challenge of the loitering crane, and studied the ground sparrow building her grassy nest. The prairie hens began to seek seclusion in the swales, and the pocket gopher, busily mining the sod, threw up his purple-brown mounds of cool, fresh earth. Larks, bluebirds, and kingbirds followed the robins, and at last the full tide of May covered the world with luscious green. Harriet and Frank returned to school, but I was too valuable to be spared. The unbroken land of our new farm demanded the plow, and no sooner was the planting on our rented place finished than my father began the work of fencing and breaking the sod of the homestead which lay a mile to the south, glowing like a garden under the summer sun. One day late in May my Uncle David, who had taken a farm not far away, drove over with 4 horses hitched to a big breaking plow, and together with my father set to work overturning the primeval sward whereon we were to be lords of the soil. I confess that as I saw the tender plants and shining flowers bow beneath the remorseless beam, civilization seemed a sad business, and yet there was something epic, something large-gestured and splendid in the breaking season. Smooth, glossy, almost unwrinkled, the thick ribbon of jet-black sod rose upon the share and rolled away from the moldboard's glistening curve to tuck itself upside down into the furrow behind the horse's heels, and the picture which my uncle made gave me pleasure in spite of the sad changes he was making. The land was not all clear prairie, and every ounce of David's great strength was required to guide that 18-inch plow as it went ripping and snarling through the matted roots of the hazel thickets, and sometimes my father came and sat on the beam in order to hold the coulter to its work, while the giant driver braced himself to the shock and the 4 horses strained desperately at their traces. These contests had the quality of a wrestling match, but the men always won. My own job was to rake and burn the brush which my father mowed with a heavy scythe. Later we dug post holes and built fences, but each day was spent on the new land. Around us, on the swells, gray gophers whistled, and the nesting plover quaveringly called. Blackbirds clucked in the furrow, and squat badgers watched with jealous eye the plow's inexorable progress toward their dens. The weather was perfect June. Fleecy clouds sailed like snowy galleons from west to east. The wind was strong but kind, and we worked in a glow of satisfied ownership. Many rattlesnakes, Massasaugas Mr. Button called them, inhabited the moist spots, and Father and I killed several as we cleared the ground. Prairie wolves lurked in the groves and swales, but as foot by foot and rod by rod, the steady steel rolled the grass and the hazel brush under. All of these wild things died or hurried away, never to return. Some part of this tragedy I was able even then to understand and regret. At last the wide quarter section lay upturned, black to the sun, and the garden that had bloomed and fruited for millions of years, waiting for man, lay torn and ravaged. The tender plants, the sweet flowers, the fragrant fruits, the busy insects, all the swarming lives which had been native here for untold centuries were utterly destroyed. It was sad, and yet it was not all loss, even to my thinking, for I realized that over this desolation the green wheat would wave and the corn silks shed their pollen. It was not precisely the romantic valley of our song, but it was a rich and promiseful plot, and my father seemed entirely content. Meanwhile, on a little rise of ground near the road, neighbor Gammons and John Bowers were building our next home. It did not in the least resemble the foundation of an everlasting family seat, but it deeply excited us all. It was of pine and had the usual 3 rooms below and a long garret above, and as it stood on a plain, bare to the winds, my father took the precaution of lining it with brick to hold it down. It was as good as most of the dwellings round about us, but it stood naked on the sod, devoid of grace as a dry goods box. Its walls were rough plaster, its floor of white pine, its furniture poor, scanty, and worn. There was a little picture on the face of the clock, a chromo on the wall, and a printed portrait of General Grant, nothing more. It was home by reason of my mother's brave and cheery presence, and the prattle of Jessie's clear voice filled it with music. Dear child, with her it was always spring. Thank you for listening to Part 2 of A Son of the Middle Border by Hamlin Garland. The story of frontier life continues in Part 3. Stay tuned and subscribe to Voxlore so you don't miss the next chapter of this American classic.